It probably goes without saying, but aside from the vote we cast as Marylanders for President of the United States, there is no more important vote than the votes we will cast for these ladies and gentlemen for the United States Senate in terms of what sort of foreign policy the United States will have in the years to come. So I want to thank you for being here in such great numbers and with such enthusiasm. I particularly want to thank, on behalf of the Baltimore Council, the candidates for being here. I would like to explain the rules of the debate. Each candidate will have 1 minute to make an opening statement which sets forth their view of the priorities facing us in the years ahead for United States foreign policy. Then our panel, which is in front of you facing me, who I will introduce momentarily, will ask candidates questions in 5 particular foreign policy areas. The candidates have been given these questions in advance, and they will have 1.5 minutes to answer. Based on their answers, our panelists will ask individual follow-up questions that are raised by the answers that have been given, and the candidates will have 1 minute to respond. At that point, each candidate will be asked a question which is prompted by the content of their opening statement, and they'll have 1 minute to respond. And then finally, each candidate will be given 2 minutes to make a closing statement. Let me now introduce the panelists that are with us, and particularly thank them for their participation. To my left is Dr. Robert Friedman, who is Dean of the Baltimore Hebrew College and a specialist on Middle Eastern politics. To my right, Mr. Richard O'Mara, who is the foreign policy editor for the Baltimore Sun. To my left, Stevens Browning, who is the Baltimore Sun diplomatic correspondent stationed in Washington. To my right, Mr. Sigmund Shapiro, who is a member of our Board of Trustees and president of the Samuel Shapiro Company. And finally, to my left, Dr. Norma Krieger, political science faculty at Johns Hopkins and a specialist on South Africa. Now, one thing I want to do before we begin is apologize in advance for what might be perceived as my rudeness in enforcing some time limits. But I think we'd all like to go to dinner at a reasonable time, and there are lots of candidates, and there are lots of questions, and so I will keep to my watch, and I will hold up a red card. This is really for the benefit of the candidates, just like this, to try and attract your attention when there's 15 seconds left to go.
You're going to give me a little elbow.
And then I'm going to thank them profusely when they've gotten to the time limit, even though they might just think there's something more to add. So if I could begin by calling on Mrs. Chavez.
It's become increasingly clear in recent years that we live in a dangerous world. We face foes and regimes as hostile to the United States as Khomeini's Iran, to General Pinochet's Chile, to Gorbachev's Soviet Union. These countries, these regimes, do not share common values with the United States. They do not believe in the dignity of the individual. They do not believe in democracy for their own people. The primary responsibility of American foreign policy is to maintain our national security and to promote our national defense. There has been no new territory ceded to totalitarianism under the presidency of Ronald Reagan. We should support those who are seeking freedom, whether that be in Central America, in Afghanistan, in the Philippines, or in Chile. Another part of our agenda must be to fight the scourge of international terrorism.
Thank you very much. Congresswoman Mikulski.
The conduct of American foreign policy depends on having a vision, a strategy, and a multifaceted plan. My vision is a world at peace where human rights are honored and there are no barriers to either ideas or markets. And in pursuit of that vision, we must follow a strategy which focuses on both national security and our economic security, which works to expand both the frontiers of democracy and at the same time our trading positions in the world. We have to invest in America because ultimately all of our strength abroad flows from our strength at home. We must seek to control weapons, nuclear, chemical, biological, and conventional, because the precondition of liberty is life itself. And finally, we need a multifaceted plan, a way to cooperate with our allies in common defense and to compete with them economically at the same time. My priority is what it's always been: people, our lives, our jobs, and our ideals.
Now, if we can turn to our panelists, the first question is on the Middle East and will be asked by Dr. Friedman. To this, the candidates have a minute and a half to respond. Dr. Friedman?
Thank you. As we all know, the Middle East is a very complex place. War between Iran and Iraq, terrorism, Afghan freedom fighters fighting the Soviet Union, war between Morocco and Algeria in the former Spanish Sahara. All of these are very important issues. Yet I think the issue that probably concerns us the most is the currently stalemated Arab-Israeli peace process. How would you revitalize that peace process?
First of all, the United States cannot bring about peace in the Middle East. Peace in the Middle East will only come about if the parties to the dispute are willing to sit down. We were able to achieve a Camp David Accord because Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem. We will only bring about peace in the Middle East when we get parties to the conflict to sit down at the negotiating table. I believe that we need to make movement in encouraging Egypt to live up to some of the agreements that were part of Camp David. I'm encouraged to know that the Vice President will be leaving to go to the region to try and work out the disputes over Taba. I would like to see Egypt fulfill its obligation to return its ambassador that it removed once Israel went into Lebanon, and to stop the kind of anti-Semitic attacks that are going on in the press there. But I believe the United States' role in the Middle East should be to encourage those governments to sit down with Israel and to work out their differences at the peace table, and in particular to encourage those governments who are recipients of foreign aid. We should use our assistance, military and otherwise, as an encouragement to peace. We should not be giving arms with the expectation that peace will follow, but should use some agreement at coming to peace and reward that with arms.
Thank you. Representative Mikulski?
First, we have to have a peace process to get unstuck. The administration seems unclear as to which one it will follow. I happen to believe we should return to the Camp David Accords because it offered a concrete formula to be pursued and is already underway with Egypt. Second, I think that we need to be able to support those people who represent building blocks within the process that could move to success. That's why I think we have to find ways to support King Hussein as one of the leaders in the peace process. He has now said that he will represent the Palestinians in the occupied territories and not Arafat, which means we don't have to try to find all kinds of ways to bring Arafat in it. I happen to think that we should support Hussein with economic aid and areas like public health measures and so on. Also, I believe that in any process, there should be no arms given to Israel's enemies. And number 5, I do believe we need to continue to work with Egypt to smooth out any wrinkles that exist in tensions between herself and Israel, and also eliminate any obstacles. And I think if we can begin to work with Jordan, woo Egypt back into the process, and follow the Camp David Accords, that we would unstuck a peace process. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you were right on time.
Do you want to tap something or something? Because
Okay.
you're out of peripheral vision. I can't see that far to the right, Mr. Cheney.
I will do it. I don't want to interrupt your train of thought, though.
That's because I'm blocking you.
Now it's time for follow-up questions on the Middle East. So, Dr. Friedman, if you will start with Mrs. Chavez.
Mrs. Chavez, you spoke eloquently about Egypt and our relationship with Egypt. But as we know, Egypt is in a very, very difficult situation economically. Although Egypt seems to be stalling on its peace process with Israel, specifically on the Taba bit of territory between the two, would you withhold economic aid from Egypt under this circumstance, or would you go ahead and give more economic aid to help bail Mubarak out in the hope that he would become more forthcoming in the peace process?
Well, I would not withhold economic aid from Egypt. I think that we can differentiate between economic and military aid, and whereas I oppose the giving of military aid in order to try and get concessions, I am not opposed to economic aid. I did not oppose and would not oppose economic aid to Saudi Arabia, for example, in order to try and get them also to enter into the peace negotiations. So I don't think that withholding the kind of economic aid that you describe would be a proper response and would further peace. I think, in fact, it could destabilize the area further and could inhibit the peace process.
The next question is for Representative Mikulski.
Congresswoman, you've spoken about the imperative of not giving any military assistance to the enemies of Israel. What do we do in the case of Saudi Arabia, which is directly threatened, it is argued, from Iran, an expansionist Iran? Would you make an exception in the case of Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely not. Again, I take the position that no military aid to Israel's enemies. The way Saudi Arabia could protect herself from the Ayatollah would be to recognize the right of Israel to exist and intend to facilitate the peace process, and we could talk from there. Saudi Arabia is also gripped by a very other significant problem, and that continues to be the falling oil prices, which is jeopardizing the economic stability of the region and is exacerbating internal problems as well as its threats. I would think that we would continue to work with Saudi Arabia, again with economic aid and with very specific projects like improving public health and other areas like that.
And now, Mr. O'Mara, if we could have the follow-up questions, again, starting with Mrs. Chavez.
Mrs. Chavez, you obviously support the President's policy toward Nicaragua in support of the Contras. There are two sides to this, and in generally speaking, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. How would you generally differentiate between the Contras, or the freedom fighters, and the more radical elements of the Palestinian movement?
First of all, the Contras are fighting to bring about change that the Sandinistas claimed they believed in when they overthrew the Somoza regime in 1979. Many people who supported that revolution believed that the people of Nicaragua would be given the freedom to vote, the freedom to have an open press, and the freedom to have a mixed economy. In fact, the Sandinistas themselves said that they were committed to those principles, and yet the entire period from 1979 to the present has been a move by the Sandinista regime to clamp down on personal freedoms of Nicaraguans and to move towards a totalitarian society, to spread its brand of Marxism and Leninism throughout the region. The difference is quite clear in terms of the Palestinian terrorists. Obviously, there are abuses that the Contras have been accused of, as there are in any war, and we should object to those abuses, but that does not undermine the integrity of their cause.
Thank you. Mr. O'Mara, for Congresswoman Mikulski.
Congresswoman Mikulski, you want no war in Central America. And in your opening statement, you mentioned, you said you would advocate a foreign policy in which human rights were valued. The previous administration in this country valued human rights and made it a principal force in its foreign policy in Central America as well as South America. Would you advocate a return to that kind of impetus?
Well, I would advocate a return to many of the approaches that President Carter used, not only in Central America, but in other places around the world. However, since the Carter administration, however, a new factor has emerged in Central America. That means the countries involved in the Contadora. In the Contadora peace process, it in and of itself calls for certain components that would eliminate the violation of human rights. For example, Contadora says it will mandate free elections. in Nicaragua. That's a violation of human rights. I think it would mean that it would end the support of, it would open up the doors for the political prisoners to be released and a variety of other things like that. So yes, I do support the principles of Jimmy Carter in the Central American area.
Thank you. The next topic is the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Mr. Jenny. Ladies and gentlemen, panel, given the importance of the Soviet-American relationship...
Just to say, it may be better if you speak into that microphone that's to your right. Thank you.
To the panelists, what do you consider as a central problem in U.S. relations with the Soviet Union, and how is that problem best managed?
Representative Mikulski?
Just a quick second. When I said I supported Jimmy Carter in Central America, he propped up Somoza. I would not advocate that or the return of any form of Somozans. But in terms of the central problem in the between us and the Soviet Union, the central problem is that they're communist and we're not. They seek world domination and we don't. They export revolution and we export freedom. Therefore, the two moral imperatives that we have in dealing with the Soviet Union are arms control and is human rights. However, when we talk about arms control, we really have to talk about weapons control. We have to talk about nuclear, biological, chemical, as well as conventional weapons that need to be controlled. That's why, however, just as a first step, I support the ratification of the SALT II treaties and also would advocate a comprehensive test ban. In terms of trade, in terms of human rights, I do believe that needs to be linked with trade. That's why I have in the past and will continue to support the Jackson-Vanik Amendment denying to the Soviet Union their most favored nation treaty status, and also believe we need to do other pressures and negotiations in terms of economics.
Thank you. Thank you. Mrs. Chavez?
I think the central problem between the United States and the USSR is clearly Marxism-Leninism and its ideology, which requires a view of history that would mandate that the world fall under communist domination. I think we've tended in the past to view the leaders of the Soviet Union as either crazy or people just like us who happen to speak Russian, and in neither case are we correct. The Soviet Union and its leaders always acts in its own interest. The way to manage our problem with the Soviet Union is to remain strong and to stop that Soviet expansionism. Nuclear arms are a symptom of the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. They are not the problem itself. And if we want to have realistic arms reduction, which I think are possible with the Soviet Union, it will be done only if we have the kind of negotiations that take into account that the dealing with the Soviet Union has to be done from a position of strength, and that the Soviet Union will reduce arms only when it is required to reduce arms because it has met an adversary in the United States that is its equal.
Thank you. If we could have the follow-up questions to each of the candidates. Mr. Browning's question will be first to Congresswoman Mikulski. Follow-up question.
You also stressed the importance of...
Maybe if you could just ask the question a little more into the mic.
Yes, thank you. You also stressed the importance of arms control. Yet the Reagan administration, which claims a commitment to arms control, maintains that one of the main problems with arms control agreements with the Soviet Union is that they can't be adequately verified and that the Soviet Union does not comply with them. What do you have to say to that?
Well, first of all, I think that in the pursuit of arms control, the only way we'll ever get treaty ratification in the United States Senate is to have treaties that we can verify. One of the most important things that we can do in terms of verification is to advocate the pursuit of not only the technology we have and the installation of that type of technology, but to also advocate strong research and verification. And scientists that I've talked to in this particular area expressed to me, and I share that concern, that such an enormous amount of intellectual effort is being diverted into the so-called Star Wars or SDI initiative, which I believe is folly, that we're taking ourselves away from developing the technological tools of verification, which is often referred to in treaty negotiations as the NTMS, the National Technical Means. So I'm for pursuing the kind of verifications we need.
Thank you. Mrs. Chavez?
Mrs. Chavez, you suggested in your first reply that the central problem with Soviet-American relations is the Marxist-Leninist ideology that propels the regime in Moscow. Short of overthrowing this regime, how would you propose we deal with it?
I believe that we compete on the international front. We have a competing ideology, and that ideology is democracy. And I favor those efforts on the part of the United States to move other countries towards democracy. And as I mentioned in answer to another question, we've seen that movement in certain parts of the world. We've seen it recently in the Philippines. We've seen it in Haiti with the overthrow of the Duvalier government. I believe that if given a choice, people will choose democracy. People do not choose to be enslaved, and communism is a form of enslavement. I think that the government of the United States should be involved in promoting its ideology abroad, and we in fact have a vehicle for doing that in the National Endowment for the Democracy, which has bipartisan support and whose aims, I believe, are to counter the spread of Marxism-Leninism.
Thank you. And now for follow-up, Mr. Shapiro's first question will be to Representative Mikulski.
Most of the panelists have mentioned unfair trade practices and unleashing the American ingenuity and the dollar and so forth. There's one piece of legislation that we have in this country called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which seems to hamper our dealings abroad. One man's commission is another man's bribe. And this seems to inhibit small exporters who have to go abroad and negotiate and do business in the world as it's done in that particular country. How about repealing that piece of legislation? How do you feel about it?
Well, that deals, Sig, with the whole issue of what they call rebates and what we call bribes. I would not support the repeal of the Foreign Corruptions Act, which I happened to support during the 1970s, some of the early days in Congress. I don't think that you do business by bribing someone else. I think that there's a lot more creativity that we could do and where we do impede ourselves. There was an article just the other day in the Sun paper by Mr. Bowie, who exports dredging equipment. He says he cannot compete around the world exporting dredging equipment because he's competing not with other companies, but he's competing with other countries. He talks about, for example, the way other countries, he gave a concrete example, other countries paid for a training program if they bought that country's equipment. That's the kind of thing I would support. I think it would be great if we used our AID money to train people if they bought Ellicott dredging material. We would help them perhaps be able to govern their own country and generate jobs for ourselves.
Thank you. Ms. Chavez?
Mrs. Chavez, one of the points that you raised about how we can deal in trade is the reduction, the weakening of the dollar. The dollar seems to have weakened substantially in the last several months. There has been no great pickup in exports. What answer do you give?
Well, clearly the fluctuation in terms of the strength of the dollar is only one component of trade policy. And I also listed reducing federal budget deficits because I think deficit spending, the interest rates at a unreasonably high level, the real interest rate at levels that make it very difficult for us to deal in international trade. These are all part of the problem, and I don't think that you can deal with one component to the exclusion of others. But I think that the original question was how we go about promoting greater trade, and I think that it is in our interest to do so. I think free trade and having open markets is what in part has kept us out of war for the last 50 years.
Thank you. Our next subject area is...
question for you all here.
I'm sorry, this is a private meeting. This is a private meeting. I'm sorry. If you will not sit down, then I will ask the marshals to remove you. Thank you. If the marshals will come and remove this gentleman, thank you.
I don't understand why you can't answer the question. All you take are prearranged questions.
We are having...
International narcotics trafficking. You did not invite Deborah Freeman to this debate. We know where you guys stand. If you touch me, you got a legal case.
Is there a lawyer in the audience?
What? Used to be what?
We start exporting the stuff instead of importing it.
Now, if we can return to the debate. To this debate. I was about to say that our next subject area is South Africa.
In each of your opening remarks, you supported the growth of democracy throughout the world. To bring about democracy in South Africa, how do you propose to do this? Do you propose a perpetuation of constructive engagement, or would you support more stringent sanctions than currently exist?
Thank you. Mrs. Chavez.
I think many Americans find it emotionally satisfying to promote the idea of total political and economic sanctions against South Africa because all of us find the system there abhorrent. But I think the result of that kind of total isolation of the South African government would, number one, either bring about its collapse, or number two, bring about a resistance on the part of the most radical Boer factions within that government to cause the kind of bloodshed that we can barely imagine in that country. I think the far better avenue is to promote the liberalization of apartheid and the building up of the kind of democratic institutions which will one day allow freedom and democracy for the black majority in South Africa. While one approach may satisfy our urge to bring about change and bring about it about quickly, I believe that promoting that kind of total isolation of the South African government will in fact not only lead to economic hardship, but will lead the South African regime, which has the most powerful military in all of Africa. There is no other African nation who can counter that threat, and it will bring about enormous bloodshed of black South Africans.
Thank you. Representative Mikulski.
I too think that the United States of America has to send a very strong message to South Africa that we want to end apartheid and that we intend to do our part in the international community by supporting very tough sanctions. Other countries around the world are calling for that. The Eminent Persons Group from the Commonwealth called for tough sanctions. The House of Representatives voted for tough sanctions. I voted for those tough sanctions. I hope the President will join us. And what do we mean when we say tough sanctions? We mean total disinvestment. We mean not only no new investment, we mean no investment at all. We also mean no imports from South Africa of any type, and we also mean no landing rights for South African planes. And yes, there will be a new government in South Africa, and what we need to do is call upon thinkers around the world to begin to develop a process of transition to black majority rule that is orderly, that is nonviolent, and will be able to take place immediately. And for once, I hope we're on the side of history and on the side of the fact that we here at this time followed the end of apartheid.